Hello, my name is Julie Kaplan, and I'm the Manager of Public Programs at the Center for Jewish History. I'm pleased to welcome you today to the launch of the volume Pogroms, A Documentary History, co-edited by Elissa Bemporad and Eugene Avrutin. This landmark volume and its distinguished roster of scholars provides an unprecedented view of the history of pogroms. We are pleased to also welcome today the Center's former president, David Myers, and Darius Staliunas. The Center for Jewish History is a home for the archival collections of 5 partner institutions: the American Jewish Historical Society, the American Sephardi Federation, the Leo Baeck Institute, the Yeshiva University Museum, and the YIVO Institute, which together create the largest and most comprehensive archive of the modern Jewish experience outside Israel. Let me briefly introduce our speakers before I pass them the virtual mic. Eugene Avrutin is the Tober Family Endowed Professor of Modern European Jewish History at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. He's the author and co-editor of several award-winning books, including Jews and the Imperial State, Identification Politics in Tsarist Russia, and The Velish Affair, Blood Libel in a Russian Town. His most recent book, Racism in Modern Russia, From the Romanovs to Putin, will be published in 2022. Elissa Bemporad is Professor of History and Unger Chair in East European Jewish History and the Holocaust at Queens College and CUNY Graduate Center. She is a 2-time winner of the National Book Award. She is the author of Becoming Soviet Jews, The Bolshevik Experiment in Minsk, and Legacy of Blood, Jews, Pogroms, and Ritual Murder in the Lands of the Soviets. In addition to today's book, Elissa is the co-editor of Women in Genocide, Survivors, Victims, Perpetrators. She is currently completing the first volume of the comprehensive history of Soviet Jews and at work on a biography of Esther Frumkin. She is co-editor of Jewish Social Studies. David Myers is the Sadie and Ludwig Kahn Professor of Jewish History at UCLA, where he serves as a director of the UCLA Luskin Center for History and Policy. He's the author or editor of more than 15 books in the field of Jewish history, including the forthcoming American Shtetl, The Making of Kiryas Joel, a Hasidic village in upstate New York, with Nomi Stolzenberg. Myers also serves as president of the New Israel Fund. Darius Staliunas is research fellow at the Lithuanian Institute of History and teaches at Vilnius University. He is the author of Making Russians, Meaning and Practice of Russification in Lithuania and Belarus after 1863, Enemies for a Day, Anti-Semitism and Anti-Jewish Violence in Lithuania under the Tsars, and Lithuanian Nationalism and the Vilnius Question, 1833 to 1940. He is the editor of the Lithuanian Studies series at Academic Studies. Before we begin, a couple of technical notes. First, you're welcome to submit questions for the Q&A portion of our program using the Q&A function visible on the bottom of your screen. You can type your questions throughout the program, but please note that the chat function has been disabled. Second, the program is being recorded and will be available on the Center's website and YouTube channel soon. We will email you the link as soon as it's available. Without further ado, I'll turn this over to Jean.
Okay, can you start the video? Hello?
Jean, you should turn your video on.
It's not turning on. There we go. Okay. Hello, everyone, and thank you, Julie, and thank you, Elissa, for organizing the event, and to Darius and David for joining us. The idea for this collection emerged from a series of conversations between the editors about the relationship between Jewish history and violence. We were particularly interested in making accessible to both students and general readers the remarkable scholarship on anti-Jewish violence that has appeared in the last 2 decades or so. We are truly grateful to our distinguished contributors, to our editor, Nancy Toth of Oxford University Press, for believing in this project, and to the Blavatnik Archive Foundation for financial support, as well as permission to reprint the many visuals which appear in the book. This volume is dedicated to the memory of our beloved colleague, David Schneer, who passed away last November. And I'll just jump right into some of the kind of the larger issues which we were dealing with. The term pogrom has cast a dark shadow on Jewish life. It has stood as a metonym for Jewish pain and across the arc of a century. Gruesome images, as depicted in photographs, postcards, and artwork, many of which are reprinted in our volume, offer a stark reminder of the trauma, which the myths and the half-truths have clouded scholarly and popular understandings of pogrom violence over the years. In our book, the term pogrom refers to a constellation of events ranging from spontaneous ethnic riots to genocidal violence. So we really cover the spectrum of pogrom violence through some 6 decades. To give you a sense of the organization of the volume, which begins in 1881 in Tsarist Russia with the 1881 pogroms and concludes in the 1940s in Poland. So each chapter of the volume is introduced by a short 2,000-word essay by a leading scholar in the field, followed by roughly 8,000 or 7,000 words of translated archival and published sources. These are diverse sources, documents, and they explore pogroms from both a top-down perspective, that is, covering the motivation, policy directives, and reactions of both powerful and state and military officials, but also from below, which we were particularly interested in exploring, that is, the experiences and emotions of the exploited and marginal Jewish men, women, and children who were very much caught up in this pogrom violence. And there are multiple types of sources in this book in a variety of different languages, both Jewish and non-Jewish. We cover from first-person sources, diaries, memoirs, and letters, to literature, to press coverage, trial records, memos, and field reports. So what we really tried to do is to give a kind of a comprehensive, multi-dimensional perspective on anti-Jewish violence from these different sources. In the remaining few minutes that I have, I would like to just discuss very briefly, the causes of pogrom violence from a very kind of a macro perspective, particularly as it relates to the earlier waves of pogroms that broke out before World War I and the Civil War. Now, it is tempting to make the argument that a deep-rooted ethnic hatred against Jews was largely responsible for pogroms. This collection, the documentary evidence we compile in our collection, takes anti-Semitism and racial language into consideration. But the authors also present a variety of other forces and factors at work, including political crisis, such as the assassination of Tsar Alexander II, and the revolutionary kind of moments of 1905. We also look at economic turbulence that was very much played a role in pogrom violence, as well as the religious calendar, the time period between Passover and Easter, and those very kind of heated moments in Jewish Christian lives. And almost always physical violence against Jews was shaped, in other words, by a complex mixture of social, political, and religious factors rather than just formal ideology. And so it is this kind of this foundation that kind of sets the tone for the larger violence. And with this, I'd like to turn it over to my colleague and friend, Elissa Bemporad, for the next comments.
Hi, everyone. Now, before I share my comments with you about the volume, I wanted again to thank Julie for helping organize this event. I wanted to thank David and Darius for agreeing to be part of the conversation. And especially I want to thank Gene my friend and colleague, Jean, it was really, wonderful and easy to work with you as a co-editor on this project. So let me start by saying that it is difficult to read, teach, and analyze ethnic violence. What I have learned by working on this volume is the following. First of all, I think that the selection of sources put together by our distinguished authors allow the reader to capture the emotional dimension of violence as experienced by victims, witnessed by bystanders, and carried out by perpetrators. The sources give a sense of how this violence, which could be intimate at times, carried out by neighbors against neighbors, how this violence was enveloped in emotions. Emotions played a role in thrusting the events. Allure of violence, anger, envy that triggered retaliation or punishment, fear, anxiety. Whether the motivation for the violence was class-based and manifested itself through looting, or it was perpetrated because Jews were identified as a threat to national security and as a vector for socialism or communism, and it was thus perpetrated to validate a certain national ethnic hierarchy and vindicate this hierarchy. This wide array of sources included in the volume, memos, testimonies, correspondence, petitions, trial experts, and illustrations, allow us really to tap into the emotions. The second lesson for me is the following. By offering a diachronic narrative of pogrom violence, the book gives the reader the framework to study pogrom violence comparatively. What was different and what is similar in the events of 1881, 1882 compared to 1898, compared to 1903, 1905, compared to 1914 to 1921, compared to the 1930s. I think that the sources included in this volume allow the reader to never lose sight of the historical context and to root each wave of anti-Jewish violence into the specific context of the socioeconomic crisis, the political turmoil, the war, the instability in the borderlands of the expanding and shrinking empires. A diachronic reading is not teleological in any way. There is no suggestion here of a simplistic teleological interpretation of Jewish history, especially in Eastern Europe, as a progressive history of destruction that leads inevitably to the Holocaust, that these different waves of pogroms were just a rehearsal for something much bigger, that the pogrom in Praskurov of 1919, when 1,600 Jews were killed in a few hours in the city of Praskurov in Ukraine during the Russian Civil War, was just a rehearsal for Babi Yar, when in the summer of 1941, more than 33,000 Jews were murdered by Germans and their collaborators. But rather that perhaps in order to understand some aspects and dynamics at work at Babi Yar, we should look back at Praskurov. So in other words, I think that much of what takes place, especially during World War I and the Russian Civil War of 1918 and 1921, helps us understand some later dynamics of genocide. So it is about walking this fine line between rejecting a deterministic teleology of Jewish history, but at the same time acknowledging how layers of violence and cultures of violence played out in Jewish history. The third lesson for me, the study of modern ethnic violence targeting Jews is a window into understanding what happened to other minority groups. This volume opens up new avenues to think about and to investigate structural similarities between anti-Jewish violence and violence against other subaltern groups in other contexts. It is a useful compendium for courses that focus on modern ethnic violence. For example, to think about the role of the state. The state as an incubator of violence. The modern nation state project as triggering violence. Or to better understand the role of the state and state authorities in the violence as the violence grows out of their weakness or of the absence of the state, which precipitates the violence. So for me, and I've actually tested this on my students, this volume allows us to think comparatively. The pogroms of 1881, 1882, and 1905 can and should be studied in conversation with instances of ethnic violence against the Armenian minority in late Ottoman Empire in the 1890s. Anti-Jewish violence of the 1930s in independent Poland can and should be studied vis-a-vis acts of violence perpetrated against the Ukrainian minority in independent Poland. Anti-Jewish violence during the Russian Civil War can and should be compared to anti-Black violence perpetrated at the same time in the US. The 1921 Tulsa massacre and the destruction of the so-called Black Wall Street offers possibilities to examine parallels in motivation of the perpetrators, trigger of the violence, responses of the victims, and erasure of the events in public memory. And finally, my last point, the fourth lesson for me, is a validation once again of the fact that we can learn more about a specific phenomenon in history by including a focus on women and gender. And this applies also to pogrom violence, which is something that comes across in the volume in different chapters. How did girls and women experience pogrom violence differently from men? Of course, there is the question of rape and sexual violence. And if we can use pogroms to measure the mass brutalization of the 20th century, marked by the beginning of World War I, then we see how sexual violence against Jewish women moves from the periphery of the pogrom script from the late 19th century to the center and becomes more and more widespread, often used as an instrument of ethnic cleansing. The focus on women also helps us rethink the category of women. We tend to assume the complete powerlessness of Jews and Jewish women especially. In fact, that is much more complicated. Besides joining self-defense units, we also have women actively responding to the violence as medical workers, writers, chroniclers of violence. Women can also become agents of violence, with instances in which non-Jewish women are eager to seize the property of their neighbors targeted for violence. But Jewish women too can become agents of violence. In the utter chaos of the pogroms of the Russian Civil War, some Jewish women sided with the perpetrators and not with the victims, as class allegiance could be stronger than the allegiance to the same ethnic group of belonging. So that by focusing on women, we can revisit the commonly expected polarity of Jewish victimhood and non-Jewish perpetrators. And on that note, I will turn it over to Darius.
Thank you, Elissa. I think it was a very nice introduction that you just did. Thank you so much for this. Okay, first of all, let me thank the organizers for this invitation. I was very surprised when I got it, since there are so many scholars who wrote much more extensively on the anti-Jewish violence than I did. But then I realized that many of them contributed to this volume. No surprise that the result is so good when you have such a dream team. Despite numerous recent publications on the subject, this book is still a very important contribution to the field. Most of the books on pogroms in modern times that I know deal with specific cases, so a comprehensive overview was really much needed. In addition to that, this book will be very useful for teaching purposes all around the world. You might be surprised, but the majority of my students in Vilnius, Lithuania, do not read any Slavic languages, not to speak about Yiddish or Hebrew. Those translated primary sources are a very important contribution to the development of this field. Introduction, as well as texts in the specific chapters, are well written, and what is also very important, very short. When you have to deal with contemporary students who prefer Twitter-like texts of no more than 280 characters, then conciseness is very important. I'll start with an explanation of how I read this book. First of all, I made a list of issues that are essential to our understanding of mass anti-Jewish violence. That list included definition, timing of pogroms and their causes, geography of violence, Jewish agency, gender issues, pogrom as a carnival, the role of the government, the outcome, role of everyday violence, and last but not least, where to place anti-Jewish violence in Eastern Europe in the summer of 1941. To my satisfaction, I found something on all of these issues. Some of them, for example, the role of the government, especially the saddest one, impact of pogroms on East European Jews are well researched and do not raise major discussions among scholars. No serious scholar will argue that the Russian government initiated or orchestrated anti-Jewish violence. And there's also a consensus that the first wave of pogroms made a sea change in the Jewish politics, although some processes, of course, started earlier. And that mass migration from the Russian Empire was caused by social and economic factors and not pogroms. But let me turn to some issues that are or might be debatable. I do not believe that we can analyze such phenomena as mass anti-Jewish violence without clearly defining what we mean by pogroms, ethnic riots, or similar terms. If I understood it correctly, then Elissa and Eugene decided to define pogroms in the broadest possible way. Let me quote. Pogrom refers to a constellation of violent events ranging from spontaneous ethnic riots to genocidal violence, end quote. They also write that this book, I quote again, treats the history of pogroms not so much as discrete events with clear origins and outcomes, but as a messy historical processes, end quote. And they also stress that it was an urban phenomenon. Despite the broad range of phenomena that are dealt with in this volume, I still wonder whether there was no way in defining the pogrom in a more precise way by including issues of groupness, imagined social hierarchy, and alleged wrongdoing by the Jews. Like, for example, the German sociologist Werner Bergmann or David Engel did. I would also like to raise the issue of the geography of violence. The book talks about East Central Europe, but we know that there were also regions that to some point in history might be called pogrom-free zones. Belarus in late 19th century, Lithuania up until World War II, Kingdom of Poland until World War I, Eastern Galicia in 1898. Of course, there are some incidents that might be called pogroms in these regions at that time, but really very few. I mean, in the Kingdom of Poland in early 80s, maybe 3, etc. So very few compared to, for example, Ukraine. What I'm suggesting is that by looking more closely at these pogrom-free regions, we may strengthen our arguments with regard to situations when pogroms occurred in great numbers. In other words, I would claim that the question of why pogroms didn't occur in the regions with very similar ethno-confessional structure and the same political regime during similar crises and other structural conditions, I mean, that kind of question is as legitimate as the one about the causes of pogroms. Let me turn to the next point. It seems to me that at least in one place, the editors decided not to disclose their position. I have in mind the issue of pogroms in the summer of 1941. They inform us that there are different opinions among scholars on how to treat these acts of anti-Jewish violence. And I got an impression that they are inclined to treat these events as pogroms but then no documents on 1941 are included in the volume. So, I mean, any comment on that, I think, would be interesting. My next and last point is the one that Eugene already touched upon, namely related to timing and causes. We know that the first wave of pogroms in the Russian Empire started in 881. There were a couple of early acts of mass anti-Jewish violence in Odessa, but they do not change the general picture. There's a lot in this volume on general causes, as Eugene just summarized, as well as something on specific cases. And all the explanations about causes that I found in this book seems to be plausible, but still I'm wondering whether there could be a short and simple explanation of why there were almost no pogroms until 881. I would also like to suggest that in the future, we may try to discern between structural preconditions, precipitants, and triggers. Some contributors, for example, Anna and Glenn, did that when they argued that, I quote, pogroms usually followed a trigger event, end quote. But in other cases, everything was put under the term causes. Thus, for example, we read that there were following causes for pogroms in the early 1880s. Political shock caused by the assassination of the Tsar Alexander II, social dislocations due to the uneven economic modernization of the empire, the circulation of rumors, and the role of religious calendar in providing the occasion for anti-Jewish violence. These causes, although they are all correct, but in my understanding are of very different importance. Only the second one, social dislocations, could be characterized as precondition, while all others are triggers. And by the way, they can be found also in the areas where no pogroms occurred at the time, for example, in Lithuania and Belarus. Thus, what I'm saying is that by differentiating between preconditions and triggers, we may give a more clear picture about the main causes of pogroms. And let me conclude. A good book should not only provide answers and a good teaching material like this, like in this case, but also open a room for a discussion. And I think that this volume meets all the criteria of an excellent book. Thank you very much. And now I turn to David.
Thank you, Darius, for that really wonderful comment. And thank you to our authors, editors, Jean and Elissa. And I want to, of course, thank Julie Kaplan and the Center for Jewish History for hosting this event. It's great to be back, as it were, at the center, about which I have such fond memories. So I'm going to just offer a few comments about the book, raise a few questions that overlap with some of those that were raised by Darius. But I want to begin by saying that the book, I think, performs a really valuable service by provoking new lines of research and challenging some long-established beliefs, among which I'd mention some that Darius mentioned, the view that the year 1881 was the catalyst to mass immigration, as earlier scholars already called into question, the view that the state was always the chief driver of violence, the view that anti-Semitism was always the main motivation for pogroms, and the view that Jews were only passive victims as opposed to being occasional collaborators or, as Elissa mentioned in her opening remarks, perpetrators of violence. So in challenging some of these claims, the book adopts a multi-genre approach, which is to say that it deploys an array of documentary sources. There are reports by Jews, by state officials, by police, by agitators themselves. There's a very, very interesting protocol of a parliamentary debate, an Austrian parliamentary debate that I recommend that you take a look at. And there are fictional accounts of pogroms. The book joins a number of other recent works that have discussed the phenomenon of pogroms. That spate of books includes Elissa's own Legacy of Blood and most recently Jeff Feidlinger's In the Midst of Civilized Europe. And that raises for me the question of why this spurt of books, as it were, about pogroms. The centenary of 1919 is one obvious explanation, but I don't think the only one. I'd also call attention to a growing interest in Churbanforschung, research on anti-Jewish violence, especially from the World War I era pogroms, as a kind of foreshadowing, an early warning of what would come later in the Holocaust in terms of the scale and methods of mass destruction, as well as an adumbration of some of the key features of Holocaust studies in its late 20th century guise. And here it's important to note the tension between that sense that some of what is seen in 1919, which is a kind of simplified version of the years from 1918 to 1921, 1970, 1921, during which violence occurred directed against Jews. There's a tension between seeing in those years indeed an anticipation of what will come and not succumbing to the kind of teleological scheme that Elissa mentioned. So my own initial interest in this volume actually emanated from another source that has not been mentioned so far. I was interested in the form of the book as an anthology of tragic events, because it reminded me of a genre of traditional Jewish literature, the martyrology, as a collection of tales of tragedies that befell Jews who were cast as martyrs because of the purity of their innocence and the steadfastness of their faith. In this context, I think of the Hebrew Crusade chronicles of the 12th century, the various reports of the Gzerot Tachvatat, the Khmelnytsky massacres, such as Yevon Mitzulav, Nathan of Hanover in the 17th century, and then more modern versions, such as Shimon Bernfeld's list of tragedies in Sefer HaDemaot, the Book of Tears, or the volume edited by Elias Cherikover with Shimon Dubnov's introduction, Antisemitismus and Pogrom in Ukraine, both from 1923. These volumes were produced as mnemonic markers, sites of memory, to enable and foster recollections of the violence that Jews have faced, as a reminder that Jewish victims were not the first and will not be the last to face lethal threats. And in that regard, the martyrology serves as a kind of ironic reminder of the endurance and ineradicability of Jews, the fact that one was not the first and will not be the last. So in all honesty, this is what I thought of when I first encountered this book, that tradition of martyrological literature. And it prompted me to formulate a very simple question, which Elissa touched on, but I would still love to hear more from both her and Gene. Why publish this book? What is it intended to do? To serve as a martyrology? Probably not in its classical form, especially given the openness to new scholarly perspectives, new revisionist perspectives that are included in it. But that meta question, I think, stands. Why? What is the purpose? And this led me to a more specific terminological query, which Darius touched upon in the beginning of his remarks, which I really understand in the vein of David Engel's famous article, Away from a Definition of Anti-Semitism. So David Engel, whom Darius mentioned, is a distinguished professor of modern Jewish history at NYU, who argued in that article from 2009 that anti-Jewish expression and violence assume so many forms in so many discrete local contexts over such a widespread period of time that one term can and should not be used to capture it all. And this line of argument of David Engel's has prompted an impassioned debate. For example, the flagship Israeli historical journal Tzion devoted an entire double issue to it. I'm not sure that I agree entirely with David's ultimate dismissal of the utility of the term anti-Semitism, but I do think it's helpful in posing a similar question about this book. What does, as Darius asked, pogrom actually connote and convey? After all, we have many different kinds of violent actions directed by and against different groups of people contained within this book. So we have bottom-up pogroms emerging from the wrath of the people. We have top-down pogroms in which political or military officials do play a key role. We have pogroms in which Jews were primary victims and pogroms in which Jews were even perpetrators. We have pogroms in which Jews are victims, and we have pogroms in which Germans are victims. So what is the historical value in applying one term to all of these instances? Well, they are united by violence. And here too, the violence at the heart of the pogroms serves a variety of purposes as an escape valve to dissipate or redirect mass anger, as liberation or redemption from some perceived oppression, as ritual or even religious catharsis or expiation, as regulative act to maintain discipline and control. And so I suppose the question that I pose in that vein that Darius mentioned of good books forcing you to not just come up with answers, but to pose questions that continue to vex you, do these various functions of violence add up to a single phenomenon called pogrom? So, having posed a kind of philosophical question, what is the purpose of the volume, and a terminological question, what does pogrom mean, I want to conclude with a final question that's of particular concern to me as a proponent of what we might call applied historical research. And that is, what do we learn from the volume that is of relevance to us today? And this connects to Elissa's 4 lessons learned, but I want to continue to push in this direction. Now, not every piece of historical scholarship need have an applied outcome, but it would seem to me that in our world of forced displacement, ethnic cleansing, and mass violence, we perhaps should be able to learn from the past to correct the present and better the future, and all the more so when we take up the question of pogroms. So what does this volume really allow us to understand in making sense of the world today, a world in which, alas, violence at a mass scale continues to be a regular and daily feature? Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, David, for your questions and comments, and thank you so much, Darius. I guess I will take a first stab at these questions and comments that are, truly powerful and important. So let me start actually with Darius. The summer of 1941, yes, we are very well aware of the work of several historians who have used the term pogrom to describe the anti-Jewish violence carried out in the summer of 1941. John Paul Chimka, Jeff Kopstein, who also asked the same question in the chat, because I'm also looking at the questions in the chat, about, why is this violence not included in this volume? Well, truth be told, we wanted to include a chapter on these pogroms, and we had thought of a possible distinguished author who could who could take the lead on putting together the sources, but the press was against it. One of the readers of the manuscript or of the proposal was fiercely against including this chapter into the book. So we wanted to push back, and we tried to push back, but the press would not, would not accept including it based on the comments made by the reader. So unfortunately, we could not include them. We wanted to include the events of the summer of 1941, but we could not. So I am in agreement with Jeff Kopstein in light of his wonderful book, Intimate Violence, and with what Darius said, they should have been included in the volume. In terms of geography of pogroms, and I will allow Gene also to address this question later, this should have been addressed in the introduction. You are right, Darius. Why were certain areas of of Eastern Europe, Lithuania and Belarus, in primis, why were they free of pogroms? Why did no pogroms Why was there no ethnic violence in these areas until, at least until a certain a certain year, a certain period? That should have been there, and that also helps contextualize why pogroms take place in certain places and in certain localities, and why they don't take place in certain localities that are in the same region. The question that both David and Darius address about defining pogrom, well, first of all, keep in mind that this is intended primarily as a teaching tool, right? This is a collection of sources for students, both undergraduate and graduate students. So the goal here is to simplify. Then during David, if you could please mute yourself. I think it's I hear a sound in the background, unless it's someone else. But sorry about that. But our goal here was to simplify, to some degree, simplify the narrative. Of course, the term pogrom, as pointed out by David Engel in his essay, "What is in a pogrom?" right, is from an empirical vantage point is flawed, right? Because it's very hard to determine what is a pogrom. But we decided, as Jean pointed out in the beginning, and as it comes across quite clearly in the introduction, to go with the most broader definition as possible. It's a constellation of events that leads to Jews being targeted, attacked, their property targeted, attacked, killed. But I think that the solution here is to really root the analysis of the specific instance of anti-Jewish violence into the context. And by analyzing the context and really contextualizing the instance of anti-Jewish violence that is being analyzed and discussed, I think that we can better understand what a pogrom is, why it takes place, what triggers it. I would like to actually push back a little bit on the suggestion on the part of David Engel to, in a way, do away with the term anti-Semitism and pogrom because it's too confusing. I think that if we explain it in the context of teaching, in the context of writing, if we contextualize it, if there is a nuanced analysis of the context, and I think that this volume does that in the different chapters, then we can still use the term pogrom. David had some excellent comments about again, the terminology, the philosophical reasons for using the terminology, and also what does this book do? Why this book? Well, for me, this book helps better understand, as I said, other instances of ethnic violence against other minorities. I teach courses on mass violence in modern Europe, mass violence in modern times, genocide, and the history of modern ethnic violence consists of entangled layers of continuities and ruptures. And I think that this volume allows us to better understand not only the continuities and ruptures when we think about the history of anti-Jewish violence, but also continuities and ruptures and similarities and differences when we think about other instances of ethnic violence that target other minority groups. But I certainly do not see this book as an example of the, I could see why it could appear as an example of the literature on martyrology, but I don't see it as such, again, because I think it is useful to understand other instances of ethnic violence in other contexts. So Jean, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay. Thank you, Elissa. And thank you for David and Darius for such wonderful comments. I'll just say a few words, just very briefly, about why this volume is kind of came out now and what it really kind of attempts to do. And one of the things that, I mean, as we all kind of as scholars know, is that the field of East European Jewish history has really kind of blossomed since the 1990s. And in these last few decades, there have been numerous just award-winning and important books published, including recent volumes on pogroms, anti-Jewish violence. If the period before 1914 was really kind of the subject of important works, even before the opening of the archives in 1991 or so, in recent years, including Elissa's wonderful book and Jeff's book and other kinds of books that are coming out, 1919 has been the focus. And so one of the things that this particular volume does is kind of bring this scholarship together into an accessible form, but also tries to, in these short essays that introduce each chapter, but also, of course, translate these primary sources which are not readily available. So in that sense, the other thing that this book does is it follows on a series of recently published documentary collections on various topics, such as Chayron Freed's monumental, really, book on everyday Jewish life, which translates numerous archival and published sources, Sarah Stein and Julia Cohen's book on Sephardic Jewish lives, Tony Michael's book on the kind of revolutionary Jewish culture, and others similar to that. And so what we have done is really take a topic that there's lots of interest from the students, right, as we all know, but we also know that there's a lot of myths and still half truths even after all of these important books that have been published. So what we try to do is, on the one hand, we have tried to kind of set the record straight in a very popular way for undergraduate students, but also I think to raise certain questions for the future. And one of the kind of questions for the future is obviously this the role of 1941. And so one question in the chat here is what would be some of the reasons why someone would object to including the 1941 chapter? And that's a really good question, right? And I think perhaps one of the reasons is because it's a complicated question. It hasn't been completely resolved in the secondary literature. And so it's maybe something for the future. You know, if we were to do a kind of a second edition of this and more scholarship appears that integrates 1941 into the larger span kind of conclusively, as it were, maybe this would come about in the second edition. But right now, I think people felt that it was there was just too much there that was, that too many unresolved questions surrounding 1941. Let's just leave it at that. And so as far as the Darius's point about Lithuania and Belarus, Lithuania does appear a little bit in some of the primary texts, but it was usually where authorities were made aware that something was going on in the southwestern regions where the pogroms were really striking in ferocity and with potency, and authorities were told to, let's watch for these kinds of disturbances and make sure that there will not engulf these regions as well. But it's an important, very important point as well. Should we?
I see, I'm sorry, Gene, just to add, I'm looking at the chat and the questions, and I see a comment by Jeff Kopstein, who's the author of a book that deals specifically with the pogroms or anti-Jewish violence in 1941. And he writes here, I understand the controversy over 1941, but the victims themselves over and over called what occurred pogroms in their immediate post-war testimonies. Did the reviewer say there were not pogroms, or was it a matter of historical scholarship? I would say, Jeff, that it was both. But I agree with you that victims definitely refer to those events as pogroms. And in the beginning, I was actually surprised that survivors, in the case of an action carried out by the Germans in the Minsk ghetto, whereby 5,000 Jews are killed on the spot, is referred to by survivors as a pogrom. So, we would have had to include, of course, a discussion of differences also in terms of the But again, it goes back to my point about anchoring the source in the context. So, Gene, I have a few questions for you. I think that one question is interesting. Would it be scientifically correct to call certain modern events actions by white nationalists as pogroms?
Well, pogrom, the term, this is one of the things, I don't know if it's scientific. Is that it's a true false question type of thing. The term pogrom, to Darius's point, has become so, definitionally so vast, right? And so it's been used and abused in various different contexts. And so sometimes, as I think David Engel points out, is that it loses its weight, right? Its currency, and therein lies the problem. I would not use that term to describe white nationalist violence.
Another question, thank you, Gene. Another question that seems interesting, again, if we think about this, the different waves of anti-Jewish violence, and David mentioned the Gzeiras Tafetat, right? The anti-Jewish violence carried out in the context of the Khmelnytsky uprising in 1648. So the question is, are the pogroms that took place before the 18th century fundamentally different from the pogroms that took place in the 19th and 20th century? And I think that this addresses the question of what is modern in the context of the pogrom of anti-Jewish violence. And I'll allow Gene to elaborate on that if he wishes, but I just want to mention that, the violence that was carried out against Jews in the context of the Russian Civil War is, and again, there are layers of ruptures and continuities again, but some of these have been called military pogroms, right? Because the violence is carried out by trained soldiers, by troops that have identified Jews as an enemy group and engage in killing them in systematic fashion. So that's when you have a violence in certain contexts that has turned genocidal. It's not genocide, but the violence is genocidal. Do you have any comments about that, Gene? What is modern and what is perhaps not so modern in the pogrom?
Yeah, I mean, and why start the book, to Darius's point, why start the book in 1881, right? And what do we gain from that? And of course, 1881 is more or less a traditionally accepted, starting point from the revisionist scholars, such as Hans Roger, who taught Russian history at UCLA for a very long time, of course, and was Steve Zipperstein's teacher, to John Clear, who has probably, who has authored the most significant book on 1881 pogroms, and of course, who would have written the chapter that I wound up writing if he were still alive. And so what is different about 1881 is, of course, now we have a very robust railroad system that becomes an important point in which rumors are circulated, in which violence we could also trace happens also by way of the railroad. And so we have these modern technological features that basically are an important part of the infrastructure of the Russian Empire, which certainly wasn't there. You could argue, of course, in 1871, but that was a small event that happened in Odessa, but it certainly wasn't there earlier. And so the modern feature, there are certain aspects of the economy that are important aspect of the anti-Jewish violence. And there are certainly continuities, including the ways in which ethnic boundaries both kind of separate and come together, and the role of the religious calendar is certainly still there, right? And it's an important point. It doesn't play that significant of a role in the Civil War military pogroms because they take on different actions. And so the book certainly helps us, as you point out, talk about both the ruptures and continuities, but most scholars would agree that there is something inherently important about 1881 time period that is unique in this violence.
Okay, thank you, Gene. There are a lot of excellent questions. We can't address all of them, but I see. I see a comment which is related to Gene's earlier comment about white supremacist violence as not, he would not define it as a pogrom. And the question here is, why isn't lynching of Black Americans a pogrom? But I think Gene was not referring to that. Quite to the contrary. I mean, some of the earlier accounts of the Tulsa pogrom that I met, of the Tulsa massacre of 1921, are actually use the term pogrom for, to identify the violence carried out against Black Americans in that context.
And I would just add that perhaps I misunderstood the question, but the similarities between the 1919 moment, or the comparisons between anti-Black violence and anti-Jewish violence across the Atlantic, right, that's happening in Chicago. And I mean, there's a lot of, not only is the term and knowledge being circulated across the Atlantic, Black Americans are then demonstrating, and we talk about this in our book as well, about the pogrom violence, right? They're very much are aware of the similarities. So yeah, so absolutely, those comparisons are absolutely important, and they're also important for kind of teaching moments, right? If you teach a kind of a course on comparative anti-Jewish violence, or this is a great kind of a class for students to look at the newspapers and how both anti-Black and anti-Jewish violence was perhaps represented in the public sphere.
Okay, thank you, Jean. And we have one last comment here by Marian Kaplan, who mentions the Red Summer of 1919, in which dozens of pogroms in towns and rural areas were carried out by white supremacists against African Americans. And I mentioned the Tulsa massacre because I'm more familiar with it, but definitely the Red Summer of 1919. I'm not an Americanist. I was not trained in this country, and I haven't really studied in depth American history. But absolutely, I think there's many structural similarities between the violence of 1919, 1921 in this country and the violence in 1919, 1921 in Russia and Ukraine. So I think that without further ado, I want to thank Julie. I want to thank David and Darius for excellent comments and questions. And there's a lot to think about. I wish we could have called on you, before the book was out, but thank you again, and thank you to Jean. This was it was a great experience.
Thank you.
On behalf of the
Thank you all.
center, I would like to thank Jean, Elissa, Darius, and David for introducing us to this really important book. And thank you to our audience for joining us today. Good night.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.